Okay, so uh, we're going deep on insulin resistance today. You sent over like a whole mountain of info, articles, summaries, even tables breaking down the hormones involved.
Yeah, it's a bit much, isn't it?
It is. But our mission, for the learner is to really grasp what insulin resistance is,
Hmm.
why it happens, the key takeaways, without drowning in all the details.
Right, like a cheat sheet to feeling in the know.
Exactly. So maybe we can start with like the core of what insulin resistance is.
Okay, so at its heart, insulin resistance is when your body's cells, think muscle, fat, liver cells, they just don't respond well to the hormone insulin. And that's a problem because insulin is critical for getting glucose from your blood into those cells, glucose being our main energy source.
So without insulin doing its job.
Exactly. The pancreas has to kick into overdrive, producing more and more insulin to try and compensate. It's like, pushing a car that's stuck in the mud. It might work for a bit.
But eventually.
You get exhausted, right?
Uh-huh.
Same with the pancreas. Eventually, it can lead to high blood sugar.
And that's where things can get tricky. One thing that really stuck out to me going through all these sources was how insulin resistance goes way beyond just high blood sugar. Like it has effects throughout your whole body.
Oh, absolutely. It's a systemic issue.
Yeah, like in your muscles, for example.
Right. So in your muscles, the ability to absorb glucose gets reduced. And where does that excess glucose end up? Often in the liver, which then can start churning out more fat. And then, get this, the liver itself can actually become resistant to insulin.
Whoa, so it's like a vicious cycle.
It is. And then you look at fat tissue, insulin usually steps in to stop fat breakdown. But with insulin resistance, that gets messed up. So you have more free fatty acids floating around in your blood, which, guess what? Further worsens insulin resistance in the liver and muscles.
Ugh, so it's like a domino effect, knocking everything out of whack.
Precisely. And at the cellular level, it's fascinating how this resistance plays out. In muscle cells, the transporters that bring glucose in, they're called GLUT4, well, they don't move to the cell surface as effectively. In the liver, insulin loses its mojo to suppress glucose production. And in fat tissue, it can't stop the release of those fatty acids as well. It creates the snowball effect.
Okay, so we've got a good handle on what insulin resistance is and how it impacts us. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about the why. Like, why does this happen? These sources pointed to some pretty big lifestyle factors like obesity, right?
Yeah, obesity, especially visceral fat, that deep abdominal fat, that's a major driver.
Visceral fat, that's the really dangerous kind, isn't it?
Exactly. It's not just sitting there. It's metabolically active, releasing all these signals that can mess with insulin sensitivity in the liver and muscles. But, and this is the empowering part, losing weight has been shown to improve insulin sensitivity. So it's a modifiable factor. We have some control there.
Right, it's not set in stone. So what about exercise? Or rather, lack of exercise?
Ah, yes, physical inactivity. And it's not just about burning calories. Being sedentary, just sitting around too much, directly decreases insulin sensitivity in your muscles.
Really? Even short periods of inactivity?
Yep, even short periods can lower those crucial glucose transporters in your muscles. But on the flip side, that means exercise can make your body more responsive to insulin. It even opens up an insulin-independent pathway for glucose to enter your muscles. Pretty neat, huh?
So getting those muscles working can make a real difference. Speaking of making a difference, our diet plays a huge role too, right?
Absolutely. What you eat has a direct impact. High intake of refined carbs and sugary drinks, that's a recipe for rapid blood sugar spikes and inflammation, both of which contribute to insulin resistance.
It makes sense. And I remember these sources talking about different types of fats too.
Right, so saturated fats have been linked to insulin resistance, potentially because they interfere with insulin signaling at a cellular level. But here's the interesting part. Unsaturated fats, the good fats, might actually help improve insulin sensitivity. So it's not all fats are created equal.
Okay, so lifestyle choices definitely contribute. But these sources also talked about genetics, right? Like if it runs in your family.
Yeah, genetics definitely plays a role. If you have a family history of type 2 diabetes, you are more likely to develop insulin resistance. There are certain genes involved in metabolism and insulin signaling that have been identified.
So it's a mix of nature and nurture, basically.
You could say that.
Now, we've talked about how insulin resistance affects different parts of the body. But are there other health problems that someone with insulin resistance might be more susceptible to, even if they don't have full-blown diabetes yet?
Absolutely. It's actually very common in PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome.
PCOS, that's a hormonal disorder, right?
Right. Yep. And high insulin levels can make other PCOS symptoms worse. Another one is NAFD, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease.
Oh, wow. And insulin resistance. plays a role in that.
It does. It contributes to that fat buildup in the liver. So yeah, it's linked to a whole host of other issues.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about lifestyle, genetics, other health conditions.
Yeah.
But what about hormones? Like, how do hormones and other lifestyle factors we might not think about, how do they affect this whole picture?
Well, think about cortisol, the stress hormone, growth hormone, even changes in sex hormones can affect insulin sensitivity. And then there's sleep deprivation and chronic stress. Those are big ones.
Yeah, we often underestimate how much stress impacts our bodies.
Right, and they affect hormone levels and promote inflammation, both bad news for insulin sensitivity.
Okay, so we've done a really deep dive here, covered a ton of information about insulin resistance. Hopefully for the learner, it's helped paint a clearer picture of what it is and how many different factors are at play.
Definitely, it's not just one thing. It's this complex interplay of cells, lifestyle choices, genetics, you name it.
But, and this is important, even though genetics plays a role, many of the biggest players, obesity, inactivity, diet, those are things we can change. We have the power to influence our body's insulin sensitivity through lifestyle changes.
Right, exactly. And that's a really important point. It's not a life sentence.
We've also seen how insulin resistance affects so many different things: muscle function, fat storage, even heart health. It's a foundational issue with consequences that ripple outwards.
So, thinking about all of this interconnectedness, it might be a good idea for the learner to consider what's one small sustainable change they could make in their own life that might have a positive impact on their insulin sensitivity down the line.
Yeah, that's a great thought to leave everyone with. Maybe incorporating more whole grains, adding a short walk after meals, aiming for consistent sleep. Small steps can make a big difference. It's about understanding your body and finding what works for you.
Exactly. It's a journey.
And that's a wrap for today's deep dive. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.